Welcome everybody to another in our series of webinars presented to you by conservation staff at Lighthawk and also staff at Surfrider Foundation. Today's webinar is a window into the future of sea level rise. And I'm struck by that photo of houses in a rather precarious position in San Diego. It's amazing what we may face as we look into rising sea levels. Next. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to go through a real quick introduction, talk a little bit about webinar presenters, our history at Lighthawk and with our king tide flights, and essentially our goals in working with partners to assess these sort of events that happen, and we can use them in a modeling sense for sea level rise in the future. But first, I wanted you to look past that text on the photo that I'm showing you and just look at US Route 1 going through Hampton Bay on a flight. I was able to take a photo of king tides. This is about 2 feet above the normal high tide level in that area of New Hampshire. And I think it's just telling how much that sheet of water is moving into the other areas of the wetlands. But just to give you some context, that's kind of what we start to look at when we're talking about inundation by higher sea levels. Webinar presenters today include Stephanie Seekich-Quinn, who is the Coastal Preservation Manager for Surfrider Foundation, Esther Duke, who is our Western Program Director for Lighthawk, and Audrey Eck-Somas, who is our Eastern Coordinator for Lighthawk, Eastern Region Coordinator for Lighthawk. They'll all have a little bit to tell you about as the webinar goes on. Just a real brief look at the history of our work in Lighthawk. And before I get to that, I just want to go over real quick guidelines on how this will work. I apologize, I should have done that really quick. As you know, most participants or all participants will be muted during the webinar. It just keeps it very simple. The webinar will be recorded and it will be shared with all the participants. We will also post it on www.lighthawk.org so people can look at it later at their leisure. There is a chat box on the right side lower portion of the panel for GoToMeeting. So when you get to the point and you have questions, please post those in there. And as we get towards the end of the webinar, we'll be able to kind of go through some of those, as many as we can. And if after this webinar, this prompts additional questions, please just contact us at any time. Any of the Lighthawk staff would be happy to talk with you, and I'm sure Stephanie would be as well. Just going back to our flights, our history sort of began in 2014 on the West Coast, where our West Coast manager was actually looking and working with partners on assessing what these tides are starting to look like as they spread inward and inland to lower gradient areas. And it really, for them, it really started to tell a story. And it really told a story of what sea level rise may look like in the future. And from that, we really took it and started to expand the program across the Lighthawk service area. And since I'm the Eastern Program Director in Maine, it's made quite a lot of sense to think about New England and other areas along our service area down into Maryland and Florida, Texas, and places like that. So our overall goals with this program and this conservation effort is to really co-design conservation campaigns that really highlight what tides are doing and how that can mimic or model what things may look like in the future. I think if you look at that picture, just take a quick look, I think on the south side of US Route 1 at telephone pole number 7, 8, and 9, I believe, that water's probably within a foot and a half of inundating that road. And that's a major road for New Hampshire to Maine. So it's really an interesting way to, portray a story. And this is a story that a lot of people have an interest in, and we want to be sure that our work in collaborating with conservation partners really has that chance to tell this story. Next slide, please. And I'd like to just look at one way how I looked at it real quick. This is a GIS layer, and I just wanted to show that same photo I took with a sort of what I would assume to be a normal tide in the same area, and you can see the sheet flow that is completely inundating the south side of Route 1. And as we transition into times where sea level rises are really going to start to impact us, that really becomes important as we get storm surges and we get infrastructure changes and impacts to those infrastructures. So it's really a compelling way to capture imagery, tell a story, include policymakers, and all of that's important stuff that needs to be shown to people. So we can really get on top of this and plan for the future. And I think I'm going to go right and introduce Stephanie Sekic Quinn, who is the coastal manager, the coastal preserves manager for Surfrider Foundation. She's worked with us for a number of years now, a great partner to work with. There's no shortage of excitement from Stephanie when we get together and plan these. So Stephanie, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's so nice to see you guys. I absolutely love working with you all. Such good colleagues. So, there's very discrete reasons why we want to do these flights. And as Jonathan said, I mean, the primary reason we want to do this is to really kind of look at what's going to happen to our coastal communities and get a bird's eye view of impacts to critical infrastructure like roads, hospitals, but then also kind of from the ecological side is to see areas maybe that might not be built and that might be actually absorbing these king tides in a good way to show coastal resource managers that it's better to not always overdevelop because nature is sometimes our best defense against these future king tides and sea level rise. So those are pretty important for us to kind of make sure that we're doing these flights in regards to that. But then what do we do with these flights? I mean, it's great to go up there. It's great to get media. It's great to hang out with elected officials, but we actually do utilize the information that we take from these flights. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll either put together like a Dropbox that has all of the images and then take a computer with us and click through the images. Sometimes we'll just print it up on a normal kind of legal sized paper and take it into meetings with resource agencies. And that can be anything, for instance, if you live in California, the California Coastal Commission, or any other kind of coastal commission that you deal with, even your local municipalities, your local city council. Those are the ones who often pass building permits. And so to take it in these kind of resources and visuals into these meetings with resource agencies and elected officials is really critical because it gives them that kind of visceral reaction to seeing in a tangible way what sea level rise will look like. And nothing offers you a better idea than being above. So these aerial shots that we're able to get kind of expands people's minds into understanding, wow, that resource is there and that road's there. And I can't explain how important that aerial perspective is. Of course, we use this with reporters. We follow up with reporters that we weren't able to take onto the flights with us. And of course, as we're doing all of this, we're not only talking about how we can protect our future infrastructure, but we're talking about what is climate change and how is it impacting our ocean and coast. So while we have this visual resources from these Lighthawk flights to influence policy, we also are using it just to generally educate the public to ensure that everyone is aware about climate change impacts on our ocean and coast. And that kind of leads me into just what I'm saying here about public education. For Surfrider, that's one of the main things that we're trying to do is understand that, our oceans and coasts truly are at the center of climate change. And so to kind of get that public education leverage out there is critical for us. We do these presentations all over to kids' schools, again, city councils, and use these resources. Oftentimes we like to do these flights, even if we're not seeing a huge king tide, or perhaps maybe we missed like a window of where the king tide was the highest. It's good for us to be up there regardless because it helps us look at just general coastal processes and general coastal erosion. Sometimes we'll be fighting a project or a hotel that we thought was maybe too close to the water, and then again, getting that bird's eye view of it kind of reiterates what our current, past, and present work will be in terms of protecting coastal resources. So yes, it helps with bringing a window into future sea level rise, but it also helps us document just what's happening on our coast and all of work that our Surfrider chapters do. Next slide. So I think, as I mentioned before, one of the greatest things that these flights do is it kind of just demystifies climate change and sea level rise. You know, some of the science out there is so far down the road, and it's hard for people to say, well, in 100 years, I won't even be around, or in 50 years, you know, I don't know what my life will be like. And so just getting that quick little window into future sea level rise just demystifies it, and it allows people to tangibly see what the future might bring. Of course, for me, and Esther and I have talked about this at length, I mean, it's very critical to these flights because it's a very intimate situation really at the end of the day. I mean, you're up in the air, there's only a few of you in flight. And so you get to really form good relationships with elected officials and media. And in fact, one of our staff members was able to take up a county commissioner at the past campaign that we did, and they made some huge strides in actually doing comprehensive land management. Yes, they were looking out the window and looking at king tides, but by the end of the flight, they had agreed on several measures of what they can do in their local communities. And they created that bond that they have with us. In the past, it's just been Surfrider staff that has done these flights, and we'd like to open it to our chapters because now we've kind of figured out the great working relationship with Lighthawk. We have a system in place, and that's kind of why we're doing this webinar is to open it up to, you know, Surfrider leaders that are around the country in chapters, and make sure that we're engaging as many people as we can to bring awareness to this extremely important issue. And then for me, it just, like Jonathan says, I definitely have a lot of excitement doing this. It's probably one of my favorite things, but for me, it helps bring my work to life. It's a lot better than answering a bunch of emails to be up in the plane and working with the folks at Lighthawk. So it just kind of brings together all the arduous work that we might do as conservationists and has a little bit of a reward to it because we get to see nature and its true beauty and form from an aerial perspective. I'm going to end it there. There's a lot of other stuff that this helps with. We've written several blogs, so you can just Google Surfrider King Tides Lighthawk, and you'll see what we have out there. But again, we can't thank Lighthawk enough for doing this with us, and we enjoy this partnership, and we are so hopeful that it's going to help change the way that reporters and the general public and decision makers look at how we're going to plan for future climate impacts. I'll hand it over to Esther.
Thank you, Stephanie. So good afternoon. Surfrider Foundation has been a fantastic partner in launching this national level campaign with Lighthawk, and Stephanie's a big part of that. Yeah, and so in our most recent last winter campaign, we did these sea level rise awareness flights in 8 states with 21 flights covering thousands of miles along the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, and got a lot of elected officials up, a lot of journalists, scientists, policy experts to see and experience that impact on the landscape from the sea level rise in king tides, and such a wonderful effort that was. I would be remiss not to mention a few other organizations who've worked with us, both at the local and regional level on this project as we developed it. So I'm going to talk about King Tide campaign flights that Lighthawk has organized with other partners. And these fall into a few primary categories. The first would be science and monitoring flights. And those started with the Wetlands Conservancy 5 years ago. We started doing these flights, as Jonathan alluded to, with their staff in Southern Washington and Northern Oregon to document and inform local conservation planning. And they shared a lot of those images with local land trusts. They also introduced us to Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition that joined our King Tides campaign for the first time this last winter, using the flights in similar ways to document sea level rise and identify potential flooding threats to the built environment, as well as looking at planning some of their restoration work. And then in the media flights sort of category of flights, we did flights with Heal the Bay staff over the South Bay region of the greater Los Angeles area with a reporter and photographer from the local national public radio KPCC, which resulted in a really well done radio segment there. We also did flights with San Francisco Baykeeper, and those were predominantly focused on photographing conditions in the San Francisco Bay and San Mateo County coast to assist with visualization of future conditions under sea level rise. And those are both to be used in reports with Bay Area officials, but also supporting advocacy initiatives of Baykeeper, including a Google-sponsored project to collect street view-like images from the water, and those photos will be used in a web-based visualization to depict sea level rise and quantify associated impacts. We also did flights with University of Washington's Climate Impact Group and brought up the university photographer with their director, and they captured hundreds of photos to be used in a variety of outreach efforts with elected officials. And also that followed up with a flight with King 5 News to highlight some of the broader work they're doing in the area. And then also a flight with University of Southern California Sea Grant. It was a suite of flights that we did with them last winter. And that gave them the chance to fly a reporter and camera crew from Vice Media, along with local coastal resource managers, including the LA County Planning Supervisor of Beaches. And on the East Coast, we had a flight with Maine Public, and that resulted in a radio story. And around decision maker flights that Stephanie talked a little bit about, we did some of those on the East Coast with other partners as well, including the Piscataqua Regional Estuary Partnership, which is based at University of New Hampshire. And that they engaged with regional planning authorities and looking at gaining support for their coastal resilience work. And that involved a few other partners like Conservation Law Foundation. And there was also a media effort around that. We've got a lot of radio stories, interestingly enough, from this effort, as well as some television, local and regional news stories. So those are just a few examples of some of the specifics of flights. If Ryan, you want to go to the next slide. And I wanted to just give a couple photo examples of both East and West Coast photos. These were both actually taken on Surfrider flights. This first one is Wells Beach in southern Maine. And the second slide shows Ventura, California. And just kind of being able to see that, how impactful it is when you realize how close those tides are coming into the built environment. So now I'm going to hand it over to Audrey to talk a bit about how best to request and plan flights as part of this campaign.
Thank you, Esther. Great. Well, I'll just really quickly kind of cover the kind of logistical aspects of requesting these flights and kind of some expectations we have for partners, some general characteristics of these flights, and then I will actually kind of share a few screenshots to show you all how to request a flight through our partner portal. So first of all, for partners, we really we have a few expectations that we kind of just want to be clear about on the front end. So first of all, we really consider the partners, the local experts. So we would love, if you're interested in doing this type of flight, we'd really like to hear from you and have the flight request actually come from you. And then kind of the most critical piece is understanding from you where and when you'd like to fly. So that involves, maybe talking to some of your local collaborators and really trying to identify certain locations on the ground that would be, expected to be the most impactful, or where you might expect to see flooding. And, in some cases, if we worked with you in the past, we're happy to share, routes that we worked on last year, and then a critical piece is looking at tide charts to determine, now that we know where you want to fly, when is the high tide expected to come into those areas, and just being aware that, depending on the landscape, the coastal landscape, the tide can vary greatly, if we're looking at both kind of the seafront area, but then also we want to see how those impacts are a little further back into the bay, just being aware of that and looking at the timing so that we can kind of work on a routing that we can, get over those areas when ideally the tide is the highest. Also, just a consideration is that, you know, in most cases, pilots don't like to fly using instruments, so they like to fly when they can see outside. So in a lot of tide charts, it will show you sunrise and sunset as well, and just kind of keeping that in mind when we're choosing dates, that making sure that, you know, that we'll actually be able to fly over those areas, and there's enough light outside to be able to, you know, deliver the message or take compelling photos of that area. One thing that we think that would be really impactful, and we found that's been impactful in past years, is actually having comparison photos for these flights. So, you know, some places are really iconic and people really know what they normally look like. And so if you show them a photo of flooding, they're going to be able to see the impact automatically. But especially a lot of media outlets have requested that they have a comparison photo. So if possible, it would be great, and we'd love to work with you on creating a pre-flight. So, you know, maybe a few weeks before the flight, flying a similar route and getting some photos that that can be used of kind of these key locations, so that when we can, you know, we can show the impact that the king tide had and really be able to easily communicate that to a wide audience. And lastly, I have on here flight guide. So that's kind of a two-part. First of all, we do like to have an actual person from your organization that would kind of act as the guide for the flight. So they're the person that that knows the ground intimately, you know, has maybe played a role in selecting the locations and can really communicate that to the passengers. And secondly, the other kind of meaning of a flight guide would be kind of we have kind of an aerial flight guide that would actually kind of give these passengers a handheld resource to use both during the flight and after the flight as well. So that might be customized to showing some of those before pictures of those areas you're going to fly over, so they can really be able to see the impact while they're in the plane. And also, especially, you know, both for elected officials and media, we found it very helpful that they can walk away with the resource, so they can really remember where they flew, and, you know, they maybe can take some notes that can help them in the ways that they use this. Some general characteristics of the flight when you're thinking about planning this: most of our planes can take 2 to 3 passengers. So in most cases, we're thinking about, you know, that flight guide and then 1 or 2 additional passengers. Ideally, that might be a member of the media and an elected official, but you know, these small planes, they are weight dependent, and so at times they can only take 2 passengers. So just kind of having that in the back of your mind when thinking about this. Also, weather is always a factor. And so as much as possible, if we can select a few dates, you know, if that's within one high tide time, or maybe, you know, this month and the next month, and trying to kind of get people to commit and block off a few different dates, that'll give us the highest likelihood of being able to get these planes up. Next slide, please. So just real briefly, we love to have flight requests 3 to 4 weeks ahead of time, and we have found king tide flights do require a little bit more planning, mostly due to the fact that there's just so many factors at play, and we're trying to get over places at very specific times. So we kind of just glanced at some tide charts, and it looks like on the East Coast, there are some higher tides coming up late summer, so kind of August through October. And then on the West Coast, there are some late fall flights, you know, or high tide times that might be ideal, as well as some January, February flights. And I think Christine just posted a link to oceanservice.noaa.gov, which is a really great resource to look at tides. And then this last slide I'm going to go through real quickly. Just real briefly, I did want to just share a few screenshots of actually how to request a flight. So here's a screenshot from our website. If you click on the partner logo, the first actual button there that's not highlighted in yellow is become a partner. So if you're not a current Lighthawk partner, please click there, add your information. We'll reach out to you and start talking to you about a flight. And then we'll actually give you a login information for the pilot portal. And that's what's highlighted here in the yellow. Is you'll click through to our pilot portal there. And then that will bring you to a login page that looks something like this. And then from there, you'll actually see the actual flight request form. And the most important pieces, I guess, to cover there are, you know, the purpose of the flight, dates and times of high tide. If you can include that information, that's just a really great starting point for us. And then including any potential passengers, their full name and email address and affiliation. And I did just want to mention, you know, putting in a flight request is actually not too cumbersome, and we're happy to take, you know, requests with partial information, and then we'll work with you to get all the rest of the information together. And Christine and I, you know, can work with you on getting a route together, really thinking through, you know, if tides are a little tricky in your area and that kind of thing as well. So I know we're running a little late on time, so I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Christine Steele, our Western Program Coordinator, and we'll start fielding some questions. Thank you.
And thanks, Audrey.
So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the side chat over here, and we can answer them for you. And I will get things started just with a question that occurs to me. And Esther, maybe you can answer this one. Does it cost anything to fly with Lighthawk? Oops, and you are muted.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. So our flights are offered at no cost to our conservation partners. And our work to help plan impactful flights is funded through grants and individual donors, and then our volunteer pilots throughout the country, which we have several hundred volunteer pilots, they donate the aircraft time and fuel for these missions. So so no, there's no cost for those interested in working with us on these flights.
Excellent. And Christine, I see that aligned with your question. Let me know, or feel free to type in a follow-up if that didn't answer your question there. Another one. So Audrey, is there anywhere that Lighthawk cannot fly? So that is a really good point. You know, so I coordinate flights on the East Coast, and I know last year a lot of the flight requests I had were for over very large metropolitan areas like Boston, New York, and Miami. And it is just good to be aware that a lot of those really major metropolitan areas do have quite tricky airspace. And so it's not that we can't fly over, you know, all of that area, but it's really just good to talk about, you know, the locations that you're really hoping to see ahead of time, and start putting those into a route so that we can look at that in kind of a version that a pilot can see, and send those to pilots and kind of get feedback from them, because that airspace can be quite congested and have some areas that you cannot fly in. Excellent. All right. Any other questions or any other points that anyone would like to make before we? Excellent. UNC Institute of Marine Sciences in North Carolina. Oh, that's great.
Perfect.
Great. Thanks for joining, everyone. So if there are no questions, I think we can probably end on time. And thanks, everyone, for participating, and thanks to all our speakers.
Thanks for organizing, everyone.
I will just add real quick that if there are any follow-up questions, I think Christine mentioned this in the chat, but for anyone on the phone or watching this later, please do contact us directly. Christine and I might field most of those questions. We can pop our emails back into the chat if you haven't seen that. And then this will be recorded and we will be sending it out. Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again, everyone.